Thanks a lot. Thanks, Kalle and Experio Lab for the invite, and thanks everybody for being here. As Kalle said, I'm gonna focus the seminar for today on the question of democracy and its crisis, and also addressing the issue of whether there's a role for design in reimagining democracy. And just to give you a very spoiler exactly at the beginning of the talk, I believe there is a role, of course, for design. And I think the point of the seminar, during the seminar, I want to try to articulate some possibilities by bringing practical examples, but also closing the talk with a little bit more of an ambitious proposition for a long-term role for design. Most of what I'm going to share, I also wanted to clarify, is part of a book project that I'm currently working on. So I would be very grateful for comments and for questions, of course, so that I can add your consideration as well in my thinking and in the work that I'm doing in the book that I'm trying to write. So for the purpose of the seminar today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk for the next 40-45 minutes or so. I'll try not to be too long. I would be very happy, I might want to say at the beginning, since the talk is quite long and articulated in 3 different parts that I'm going to introduce in a second, I will be also very happy if people have burning questions to maybe drop them in the chat or even interrupt me. You know how this works. I mean, I don't see you all. It's always so difficult. But I would be happy if maybe, Kalle, you can help me if there's anybody who is raising hands and try to come in as I develop my argument. So in the first part, I'm going to give you a very brief introduction to myself, but then I'm going to I've organized the seminar in 3 parts. In the first one, I'm going to try to sketch what is this landscape in between design and democracy, as I see it. In part 2, I'm going to introduce what I call democratic design, following from Michael Soward, the work of Michael Soward, and I'm going to talk about his work in a moment. And then in part 3 of the talk of the seminar, I'll try to put forward my definition for a version of democratic design towards the reimagining of democracy. So briefly about myself, also to position a little bit my talk and where I'm coming from. I'm currently based at the University of Applied Science in Bern, in the University of the Arts, where I co-lead with others the Institute of Design Research, where I mostly teach and research in the field of social design, which is quite a wide field. And I'm very interested in my work around questions of quality of participation and democracy, of course. I don't have a classical design background. I did at the beginning. I mean, I used to think it was a bit of an exception, but I'm now actually coming to terms with the fact that there is quite a well-established trend. A fact, I believe, like many others in my field, in fact, I studied something else in my previous path. I studied political theory and anthropology, which is actually where also my interest and my understanding of democracy and democratic theory, that's where it comes from. I only later, during my PhD, specialized in something called design anthropology, as I got more interested in the question of design and also the role of design in developing meaning, but also symbols that we use in nurturing our political and democratic imagination. I also think I want to mention that I've been, for the past 20 years, working mostly in and out of academia and practice, which means that I had an opportunity to work with on different issues and also work looking at democracy in its various forms, in different forms. Some of the contents that I'm going to share today comes from my doctoral thesis and the work that I started doing at that time and the book I'm trying to write now. But I also draw on reflections and learning from working for 3 years, a little bit more, in the democratic sector. And so I wanted to acknowledge, before I start delving into the content of the seminar, that, of course, a lot of my thinking is absolutely in depth to the many democratic practitioners I've worked with, which are those people who professionally work to design and facilitate democratic spaces in and outside governments, including, of course, also policymakers. And then I wanted to mention 2 people. with whom I've been in many conversations regarding democratic design, this idea of democratic design, and this would be Max Stearns, but also Joe Harrington, who, to whom I'm indebted for the concept, the idea of generative democracy that I will be briefly refer to towards the end of the talk. So during the seminar, I'm using this space to really try and rehearse or play a little bit like with this argument that I'm trying to build in the book. The first point that I make in my argument, the first reflection that I want to share, is this idea that design is inevitably involved in designing components and social affordances for democracy. And I understand these social affordances to actually be those possibilities that for social interaction, but also for social action, that are usually shaped by norms, by practices, by social practices, but I would argue also by design, by our design work. And the question on this first point of the argument is to what extent are designers actually aware of the role that they're playing when they design. I hope this will become clearer in a moment. The second point of the argument is that design actually per se, I believe, is neither good nor bad for democracy. And it depends exactly on the way in which design is used in democratic space. And the third point of the argument is that this relationship between design and democracy that I'm trying to articulate in a moment is actually a growing relationship with different modes in which these two concepts come together. And I believe we should pay more attention to these interactions. And the fourth point is what I want to articulate in the seminar today, this idea of this proposal as well for democratic design to be some sort of different practice of design that has a broadened object and actors, and that requires some and affords a democratic sensibility. So this is the overall argument that I will try to build today. And I'm going to start in part one of the talk by really trying to sketch this field that sits between design and democracy. And what I believe in my opinion, and of course the challenges in between in this area. I'm going to provide a quick overview of some key works in this area, but I wanted also to clarify that this is by no means an attempt to build a comprehensive review or a comprehensive literature. I also had, for time reasons, to very much focus the attention on those books and works which directly reference the concept of democracy, which means that, for instances, I'm going to leave out some other fields that I think have a lot to do with design and democracy, which are those works that reflect on political role of design, or, for instance, the work of design in policy making or in governance, which I think are, of course, directly linked to democracy, but are out of scope for the talk today. And for time reasons, I'm also going to focus on most recent works, which means that I'm going to start roughly around 2017. We're going to start this journey in a second. But I'm very aware, and I wanted to acknowledge that the field has a long history. And of course, you arguably starting from the time of the 70s, the time of the democracy of work movement in Scandinavia that had so much an impact on design. But I would argue again, with Linköping University, and again from Scandinavian context, they celebrated in 2021 100 years of democracy and design. So I guess we're talking, and this is important to say as at the start for me, we're talking about a really robust, long-lasting, diverse field, and I'm only going to really provide a small window on this field. So I chose to start our journey into sketching the landscape with the call from Manzini, Ezio Manzini, and Victor Margolin in 2017 to all designers and educators to stand up for democracy. Because I think this was a significant moment, I believe, in the design field, where designers from different fields of design, different areas of design, as well as publishers, I think editors, they were like really expanding the call to a wider range of designers, understanding design quite broadly, they were asked to produce a statement and participate or reflect on the ways in which their design practice and their role in the design field was contributing to saving democracy. And I also chose to start with this call because Manzini and Margolin, I believe actually building on work from Margolin from before, they developed this interesting way, perhaps a bit schematic, that has been used a lot and referenced a lot to map the terrain of what we're talking about. So they described these 4 quadrants of design of, for, as, and in democracy. And I'm not going to go in the details, but I think these 4 modes cover different ways in which design and democracy get together. But I also think these modes are mostly articulated, of course, from the perspective of design, and mostly put forward an understanding of design, a certain understanding of design, which is sees design as a service-oriented practice, where design is at the service of, in this case, democracy. And I'm going to suggest, actually, we do think about a more nuanced relationship when we think about this relationship between design and democracy, where design is not simply at the service of democracy. Interestingly, again, going a little bit chronologically, in 2019, the German Association for Design and Research, in these call for papers and from 2019, they put forward the idea, I think maybe a bit uncomfortable, an uncomfortable idea for design, that design as much as part of the solution to crisis of democracy, which is what Margolin and Manzini kind of assumed, could also be co-responsible or responsible somehow of this crisis. And they were, in fact, asking for contributions that were investigating this relationship. So how can design and designers, there's a little sound in the background. Okay, super, sorry. I was going to say this was a different relationship, as I said, perhaps a bit of an uncomfortable one, where designers, through their communication design, through their messages and symbols, they contributed to successfully in supporting populism and the rise of the new rights movement. Now, the question for me would be, okay, so in this understanding of design and democracy, what should we make of these instances of design for democracy, of this relationship? Is this a legitimate one? And I argue actually from the point of view of democratic design, and I hope I'm going to make this clear, I'm going to say a little bit more later, that actually this would not be an example of democratic design. But I'm going to explain why, in which way, following, of course, the definition from Michael Soward. The next books that I want to put into dialogue and I want to reference are these 2 ones which are interesting in many ways. They were published in the same year, so we're now in 2021. And they come, interestingly, one from the field of design and the other one from the field of political theory. So the one on the left, I think, of your screen as well, is the one is an edited book from Michael Herloff and Mattia Rezzai, which is an interesting attempt from design to map this terrain. That in the book, many authors argue is becoming more established. And what is interesting of the book, I mean, there's many very relevant publications and contributions. I think what's really interesting, of course, is that it does present a really good overview of a variety of ways in which design and democracy are connected, going from examples of design activism to design justice or design in policymaking and many others. The book on the right is actually from political theory, as I said, and it's the one that we're going to look into more details. I don't know if you can read very well, but that is the book from Michael Soward on, again, the title is Democratic Design. What I think is interesting of looking at this book, and we are in 2021, is that they're published in the same year. One is from design and one is from political theory. I think there's something perhaps that is signaling us that there is a growing interest and maybe also the kind of formation of a joint field of research and practice, which I would argue is actually needed, that is getting more established and sits in between design theory and practice and democratic theory and practice at the same time. And the last book that I want to reference is one of the most recent. We're in 2022, but it's not the main reason why I want to reference it. And it's the book from Carl Di Salvo, Designers Democratic Inquiry. And the reasons why I want to refer to this book are many, but I want to maybe just forward three main reasons. The first one is that Di Salvo addressed the question of the role of democracy, of design for democracy, very much as a role that has to do with creativity and imagination, which is something perhaps lacking in some of the other books that look at other roles a bit more practical, maybe the ones that we have seen more in examples of design in governance or design in policy making. And actually in this book, it goes back into really exploring how creativity and imagination are central when we talk about design and democracy. And I would very much agree with that position. The second thing that Di Salvo does is that it does address the question of what is democracy? What democracy is it talking about? Again, that is not done in most of the other books that give a little bit like that question for granted. What type of democracy he's talking about is the first thing he starts clarifying. And he's not talking, I mean, for those of you who know the work of Di Salvo, might not come as a surprise. He's not talking about the institutional democracy or what happens in government or what happens in the parliament. He's talking about the other spaces as democratic spaces, and democracies are something that happens in the everyday. And finally, he asks in the book, which is, I think, the main intention of the book, what existing design practices could we use? And he gives some ideas and suggestions, but also what new modes and more new theories of design do we need for developing a practice of design that is a democratic inquiry? And I think all these elements are actually are very relevant questions also in my work that we need to address in order to really explore this topic. Questions like, what democracy and what design? In this group, I believe, I don't know exactly who is present today, but I know a little bit from Kalle. There might be people from design, of course, and also people that work in democracy, that work in different organizations, or democracy widely intended as those who work in other institutions and formal or informal groups that try to advance democratic outcomes. So maybe we do assume that we understand both concepts and it's very clear what we're talking about. But actually, I think as soon as we start really unpacking, as soon as we go closer to these words and the topics that we're trying to discuss, that we're discussing today, I think we do need to realize, and I believe that's quite obvious if we start questioning it, that actually both concepts are quite wide and huge. They're still disputed. They're both coming with many adjectives. We have different modes of democracy, as well as we have many practices and many approaches to design. And I think that is an important part of the conversation that we don't always address. So, for instance, if we understand democracy as being about the free vote and in multi-party elections, then we might be looking at the work of those designers who have designed the electoral process, or maybe the graphics for the voting papers. Those would be examples of design of democracy that we can think of. But we could also think of democracies as being representative democracies. This is the picture of the European Parliament that you're looking at. And if we imagine the Parliament, so this space where people that have been elected, our representatives from one party, sits together confronting and meeting and getting to know and work with those from the other parties that might have very different opinions, of course, and all the very different values from themselves. If this is the idea of democracy that we have in mind, then the designers involved making this space, I think it would be very different ones. I think we can imagine that there's been interior designers, sound designers, or light designers, of course, involved. But in the definition that I'm trying to build of what is this kind of democratic design, and we're going to look at that in a moment, I would not count these modes or these examples of design as instances of democratic design. And I think that could be an interesting conversation also for us later. And what about cases where actually democracy happens in unexpected places, more or less formal places, like a work? And the example that I mentioned briefly before, I mean, is the idea, this is also present in democratic theory, but is very strong in design, from participatory design, this kind of movement that started with an ethos of democracy at work, which was very central to the movement itself. So I think, again, looking at this picture, we could imagine there's several designers who have been involved if we understand this as a democratic space. There's those who have designed the assembly line that might have less or nothing to do actually with democratic potential, with its democratic potential. And those who designed intangible ways of allowing actually workers that are at work on this assembly line to participate. And these might be actually the kind of designers that we're looking at. Those who have designed the intangible components which are not visible in this image. But what about the other designers that have designed the assembly line? And what designers have been involved, if any, if we frame democracy as a space for protest that might be organized in unexpected places, maybe outside, perhaps even against designed democratic spaces and designed democratic institutions. So the first point that I've tried to articulate, design is inevitably, even when we design a public road, where protests might happen later, or the interior of the parliament, and so we just see maybe a component of democracy, we are involved in designing these components and social affordances for and of democracy. But as I've said also before, not all these designs can be defined as democratic design. That's the point that I'm trying to make. Why? To answer the question, I think I want to turn to the work of Cameron Tonkin-Wise and one of his provocations, which was actually also a response to the Stand Up for Democracy call from Margolin and Manzini. In this blog paper that he has been working and reworking many times, is actually warning us that democracy actually must be defended, it says, by undemocratic design specifications. And there's many interesting things he says in the paper. And again, 3 points that I want to maybe bring forward to build my argument. So the first one is that he introduces this idea of undemocratic design, which is one of the points of my argument. The design is neither good nor bad. It does, in the paper from Tonkin-Wise, comes really clear that there might be instances where we don't want undemocratic design have anything to do with our democracies. And it might be like, we go back to the examples from the German design associations and their call, their conference to reflect on the impact of design in the rise of new rights movement. The second point I think that he makes in the paper again is that, as he says, it's naive to simply call for more democracy without actually saying what type of democracy are we talking about. Because there's many different democratic forms that might produce different democratic outcomes. And the third point, and I'm going to elaborate a little bit also on this one, is it tells us that quality of democracy, so for instance, whether or not democracy can be axial in resisting fascism, mostly depend on whether democracies have been repeatedly redesigned to do so. So the original intention of the designers are involved. And Tonkin-Wise in the paper builds on a very important, I think, political concept and illustrates what is this idea of a democratic paradox, which I think is important to understand when we talk about design and democracy together, that entails that democratic forms are not the same as democratic effect, And that democracies, which might be democratic in their forms, so they might have multi-party elections, they might have democratic institutions in place, etc., still can be illiberal in their practice. In democratic theory, this is referenced a lot as substantial and formal understanding of democracy. And I think as soon as we understand this difference again from democratic theory, we understand that democracies might also be dying also through democratic means. And I guess we can think about the several elections that we have had and we will have this year, which is 2024, if you know, has been, I think, called the super election years for democracy because so many democratic countries have gone through election in 2024. Democracies might die through electoral democratic processes. So the question becomes, therefore, a question of qualities of democracies and practices of democracies and which principles and which values we want a democratic government to embrace. So back to the question that I had from the start, and also based on what we just discussed. So this idea that democracies come in different forms, qualities of democracies, principles and values are actually central to ensure that democracy still uphold on democratic outcomes. What is the role of design? And I think the answer from what I've already also said is that there are different roles for design, because what we were one of the point of my argument from before is that design is inevitably involved in designing these components and these affordances of democracy, but some are not intentionally engaged with the question of democracy. In some cases, democracy, I would say, is almost like more like a byproduct of the design work, like in the example of the designers who might be involved in the graphic part of an electoral papers. Democracy might be a byproduct, but was not the intention of these designers. And I argue that in the seminar today, what I want to focus is that of these different roles of design, some more or less intentional, I want to try to explore and expand a little bit on this, on these modes which are more, of course, more intentional. What I call building on Michael Soward, democratic design. Let me say that, I mean, this word, this phrasing of democratic design is actually something that I found, I encountered the first time when I was working with democracy, organization that works in democracy and democratic practitioners, as I was defining them before. These are people which might have all sorts of backgrounds, including design, but not only design. And they all refer to their work as designing, and they all refer to this idea of democratic design. That's the first time I encountered from those who practice and work to design and facilitate democratic encounters or dialogues. And then in 2021, Soward wrote the book, published the book, which put forward this term, but also a framework for how he understood democratic design. So we're going to look a little bit about what he's proposing as a role for design in democracy. And in the book, there's a lot of details about this democratic framework. So for those of you who are really interested, I would really recommend to read the book. It touches on, gives some examples, but it also touches on how is this approach different from other theories of democracy. And I'm going to just give some introduction that, again, are very helpful, perhaps, in building, I hope, in building my argument. So Soward, again, this is a democratic theorist, somebody who has worked in political theory and published in political theory and reads political theory books normally. And he takes a step in this book from this normative vision of democracy that tells us what democracy should be. What is a representative democracy? What is a deliberative democracy? And through this book, he's trying actually, through the framework as well that he's building, he's really interested in real existing democracies, he says. As he's asking the question in the book of how might or how should democratic institutions and democratic practices be organized or be enacted or activated for a given time and for a given place. So he's really trying to get in in the real existing democracy and the messiness of those democracies and how they are really enacted and how we find them in the everyday, not how we describe them in democratic theory. And with the real aim, which I also think is really interesting, of fighting what he calls the risk of ossification of our democratic forms, that we get stuck into how we understand democracy, how we practice democracy, and we repeat that again and again. Actually, Soward sees a role in design and puts forward this kind of democratic design framework exactly in advancing this hybridity in democratic actions through combining different modes of democracy, but also through deconstructing other ways of democracy that we are, and the assumptions that we make about them that we are used to see or used to understand. The object of democratic design, Soward tells us from the book, is quite diverse. It depends on the time and the context and what societies and would-be designers are engaged by or troubled by or interested in a certain time, in a certain place. So it's describing a practice, again, this will be very familiar to design, which is very contextual. That is less familiar to democratic theorists in a way. And generally speaking, I think it talks in a very simplified way, but it talks about what is this democratic design, what is this object of democratic design, is, so what tells us is a practice that enacts specific political principles. Now, this point of the political principle, I think, is really relevant. This is where I think the example, again, of the graphic designer that might be designing the voting papers comes back again, because that example might or might not be an example of democratic design based on whether the designer frames or not their work as intentionally being democratic and whether or not they frame their work as being within certain political principles. So what are these political principles? Soward distinguishes between required principles and ordering principles. The required principles, he says, are the ones that are necessary to achieve what he calls the democratic minimum, to ensure that our design is somehow democratic in its essence. And I think this is a really important, useful concept that we can take from Soward as we try to understand the relationship between design and democracy. In the book, he explains what these 6 requirements are about. I'm not going to go into the details, but they have to do with the idea that we have to have a community of reference that, of course, refer to a certain democracy. There's terms for the membership, how you are a member, who is a member, who becomes a member. We need to define the modes for governance within this democratic minimum, and we need to provide for equal opportunity and access to resources to the different members of our community that we're referring to. This idea of democratic design and the democratic minimum that Soward brings forward, I think, is actually really helpful, for instance, in understanding and positioning these examples that we were looking at before. This example I saw before, like I said before, like these are not perhaps examples of democratic design. My argument was coming from this understanding. If we have a definition of democratic design that has to be about the democratic minimum, maintaining the democratic minimum, as soon as the design outcomes through populism, through new rights movements, goes away from that democratic minimum, we could argue for that work of designers, which is very successful from the point of view of design, to not be actually an example of successful democratic design, because it doesn't achieve the democratic minimum. I think this is an example of how we can use that concept in our practice. And then he talks about these ordering principles, which are also very, very interesting, I think, because these are the ones that really allow us to design on top of the democratic minimum. Here, the focus actually is less on what we design and more on the principles that we embrace, because the same principle might be enacted through different democratic design solutions. And we can, I think in this way, building on SOWOT, again, really appreciate how the same design practice might be mobilized to achieve different principles. So, for instance, like how a prototype or a participatory workshop might look quite different if it aims to expand the basic democratic rights, for instance, or it wants to follow the principles of decentralizing democracy, or wants to really deeply challenge how we understand democracy overall. So the principles, more than the outcomes of the design, actually become central, and different democratic design solutions might be enacting the same principle. So in the book, SOWOT also raises another really important question, which is always addressed. I think we have been asking that a lot in design, and in democratic design is asking who designs, who is the designer? And it gives, I think, a really, again, interesting and different answers. So if the thing I'm reading, if the thing being designed is democracy, then can or should the work of design be done democratically? And for example, should the many have the chance to modify or reject designs made by the few? I think this is a really interesting question, because many designers in the policy field are really worried about design losing control on the quality of our design, or losing their role if everybody designs in a context where everybody designs. And I think what is interesting is that SOWOT flips this question on its head and raises the question of the democratic rights of the many to stop the design of the few. This is a different way of thinking about our work, for instance, in the policy context. And I think it's a very interesting point within this design to bring a different light in our design discourses around the role of designers in policy making. And I hope this is maybe another point that we can pick up a little bit more in the conversation in a moment. So who is this designer that does the democratic design? So what says it depends, and it depends on how much we choose to emphasize the democratic in the democratic design combination. And I think so the answer therefore would be collectives, if we want to emphasize the democratic, or professional designers. That's also an option if we want to put the emphasis on design. And a more inclusive process of democratic design might produce, a more participatory process might produce more robustly democratic designs, which I think is an intuition or an understanding that we have also learned from within design, and specifically from the participatory design movement. So what is also interesting of SOWOT book is this radical pluralism that he really promotes in understanding what is the role of design and what is the role of democracy and what is the potential of democracy. And I'm going to build on this idea that democratic design comes in a great variety of forms to really bring forward my, let's say, own contribution on what I'm working on at the moment in the final part of the talk, which is this idea that I'm tentatively calling generative democratic design. So in a draft definition, I'm understanding, I'm shaping, I'm describing these generative design, generative democratic design, as an intentional and collective practice of design that aims to contribute towards new modes of democracy, to advance radical inclusive political principles, and to achieve a democratic maximum. So I build on SOWOT, but I also propose some distinction from his work. As I understand generative democratic design to be always collective, for instance, I build on the long tradition of participatory design from within design, always to aim to achieve what I'm calling the democratic maximum. So going beyond and on top of the democratic minimum, as SOWOT defines it. And this maximum can be made of different qualities depending on what principles we decide to advance intentionally. So the role of the principles, these political principles, becomes really central in my definition, because we can imagine democratic design being involved to make explicit. It could be almost like a phase in another phase, an additional phase in the democratic design steps, where designers are involved before even starting any design work to make these principles explicit, discuss them and then negotiate them with the others, so that they achieve an alignment on these principles before starting the design work as an outcome, actually, almost like in itself, for what I'm calling this generative democratic practice. So this idea of generative democratic design resonates with what recently has been introduced as a practice of design for regenerating policymaking. The text that you see here in the cover of the publication is a recent, very interesting publication from Lucy Kimball, but also Catherine Duros from Public Policy, Ramya Mazet, and I believe Liz Richardson, I think, which did a large investigation of the role of design in policymaking in the UK. And they reflect critically on this different relationship between design and policymaking. And they come out with this novel idea for design for regenerating policymaking as another role, as another relationship that design can have with policymaking. And there's many concepts that I like and I would refer to, I would resonate with my work, of course, and my idea of generative democratic design. But I also believe that there's some differences in my understanding, in how I understand the generative part. And I'm going to try and finish on this, on trying to articulate these differences, or how I see generative democratic design being generative in different ways. And mostly I'm going to talk about these three modes. So the first one, in my understanding and in my work, I understand generative democratic design is generative because it recognizes that democracy needs to be renewed and regenerated continuously. This was a point that we saw before from Cameron Tonkin-Wise. But this is also the concept, the main concept, I think, in this quote from Dewey that I used to for the introduction to this talk, where Dewey, in the middle of this very deep crisis of democracy, of course, said that part of the reason why we were in that crisis was the fact that we have been acting as democracy was something that perpetuated itself automatically, like a machine that had been put in motion, and that didn't need any other work or contribution from any of us. So with Dewey, and like Dewey, I do also think democracy is not something that is given. It's not a machine that perpetuates itself autonomously. And I also think this idea of perpetuation, this idea of democracy as a machine, is also the idea of where we risk actually approaches that bring us to the ossification of democracy, what Soward was talking about before. I think democracy is actually something, the opposite, is something very creative, something very imaginative, that needs the imagination of all those involved in order to renovate itself. It's something that has to be continuously redesigned in order to achieve certain democratic outcome. And without going into too much details on this part, but I believe, and maybe this is a bit different from Dewey, that this idea that democracies need imagination and to be repeatedly redesigned to do certain things is not actually new, as we learn from the political philosopher Ezrai, who tells us that in a book called Imagine Democracies, he tells us that political and social institutions are all, or can be all, understood as collective political fictions, like the divine rights of the kings to rule that we believed for centuries was actually true and was coming from the God. So our current institutions, I think, are still the results of our imagination. That's an important point in my work. And it is still a result of these political fictions And we need to become aware of these fictions, these rituals, tropes, and institutions that Edra is talking about in order to realize that the way out of the current crisis of democracy is to make visible these tropes and these rituals, these assumptions that we have embedded in our democracies, but also to imagine, of course, democracies otherwise. And this is where I see a really interesting role for generative democratic design to play. The second way in which democratic design is for me generative is because it does not only generate new answers, but it formulates new questions, adopting really like a more anticipatory approach that allows us to resolve problems that might appear to us non-resolvable today, but also to anticipate other problems. And I'm going to give you a very practical example of how that might look like in practice by talking very briefly about this, the Scotland Assembly, the Scotland Climate Assembly from 2020, where Scotland asked citizens the question of how should Scotland change to tackle the climate emergency in an effective way. Now, Citizens Assembly have, for those of you who might be familiar, we can talk about that later, otherwise, have a very bespoke, a very specific design, a very specific democratic design. So for a gathering of citizens to be considered as citizen assemblies, you need some key requirements. The first one is sortition. It's this idea that the assembly is representative of is a mini version of the general public in this case, Scotland. So Scotland went to recruit people to be part of the assembly that had the same representation of ethnicity, education, they were coming from gender back, and they had also opinions about climate that were representative of the general public. Assemblies also typically go through these three phases, which are crucial to be called an assembly. The learning one, where participants hear from different experts to learn about a topic, and this is a really fundamental phase because the assumption of an assembly is that you don't need to be an expert already informed about the issue in order to form an informed decision. The deliberation phase, which is where they go into groups or into plenary, and through facilitation they critically engage with the information that they've received to develop a shared decision. And of course, the final part, the decide, which is where the assembly deliberates. So they issue recommendations that are going to be, we hope, taken into account by the convening body, the one asking the question. So these phases are not linear. We might go back in time and repeat, learn and deliberate, but these are the three key components. So now what the assembly did, which I think was a novel move, is that they did identify the new questions outside of the given democratic design, the formal good democratic design. They thought that to address that question, for Scotland to tackle the climate emergency in a fair way, they had to address the issue of engaging in dialogue across generations, future generations. So they asked themselves these questions, and they tried to do this to hear from future generations in two ways. They worked with the Scottish Children Parliaments to integrate their activities in the Assembly. So the children and the Children Parliaments went through a similar process as the one from the Assembly. And they also used something that would be even more familiar to design, I think, which is this idea of scenarios, really developed, I believe, with the contribution of the Forum for the Future. They developed 6 scenarios that were describing the life of a person in Scotland in 2040. So they did, I think, really produce a generative move. They didn't just introduce innovation in the democratic design, but they asked a new question and they started a new debate. So people started discussing the importance and the rights and the ways, practical ways in which those who are not present, like the future generation, could be involved. And the third point, which is my final one, is how I understand generative democratic design to be generative because it reflects on this relationship between design and democracy. how design generates democracy as well as how democracy generates design. And we're usually focusing especially from design, in how design shapes and influences our democracies. But and I think this is not new. I mean, it reflects on the role of design in how the objects we design, we make things that make people, and it's really part of the design reflection. But when we look at these studies of design and how it influences democracy, I think, I mean, interesting work is the work from Jimeno Martinez, who has been looking at the mechanism through which nations remind their citizens that they belong to a nation. If we understand nationalism as something that comes from the bottom up, as something that is what Professor Billig has called banal nationalism, as something that we learn from below, from the everyday, then the design has a role to play in designing these political fictions, we could call them, as I was calling them before, that will allow citizens to feel that they belong to a certain nation. But how modes of democracy and qualities of democracy influence the role of design, I think this is what is less studied and it is less under-researched. And I'm bringing back again another piece of work from the Scandinavian context, which is this book on Swedish design from Keith Murphy, which explores exactly that question, I think. It is mostly an ethnographic work that explores how the cultural context and the values of Swedish democracies influence and shape what we understand today as the good Scandinavian design. And I'm reading the quote here. So, alongside an expectation that the Swedish political system is organized to care for its citizens, design things in Sweden are expected to care for their users in ways that align with political and cultural values. So how these political values and principles, which are contextual, which are historical and cultural, influence design, is actually what I think is a much less researched area, which is basically focusing on this relationship and how they unfold. And this is how I understand the role for generative democratic design, to really look as a practice that is transdisciplinary, to really look at this relationship as co-generative. We mostly hear from design, and we have recently started hearing a little bit more from political theories or democratic theories, but I think, and this is where the value of SOWAD books, I think, lies, we need to understand how political theories articulates the value of design, so that we could, from within design, maybe review some assumptions of what is our role, some ossified understanding of our practice, what design is, what is unique about design and its value. And I believe I'm gonna close here, as I think I went a little bit long. But thanks for listening, and I'm gonna try to end my presentation.
Thank you very much, Paola. Very interesting presentation. I think I will maybe take away this highlighting of you for everybody, and I hope that we can start some kind of discussion, reflection, Q&A, whatever. So please raise your hand if you have something you want to contribute with, or maybe a question directly to Paola, or just a reflection of the presentation or your thoughts about it. So please don't be shy, and please also put on your cameras so we can see each other when we discuss and speak. So who is up first? Who dares to raise their hand? We have Daniela. Welcome. Nice to see you.
Ciao, Paola. Thank you for the presentation and starting to bring some input that help us to reflect on something that we give a lot for granted. And And it's also a concept that personally I haven't so read about so much, so I'm not that familiar in that depth. And I some of the concepts really like this democratic minimum and the fact that you build on top, and generative ideas that somehow is a reciprocal influence between design and democracy and collectives, let's say. So in my mind, I was starting to think, I should invite Paola to come to speak to my class, to have the conversations. And then I say, my class is very diverse, and they come from many different countries with very different geographic and different political systems. So because there is on one side this idea that design is plural and is representing different, it should consider different context, different situation. And as you also said, it's a very situated practice, no? How would you bring these conversations in a very international class of students, reflecting on what democracy and democratic design is?
Thank you, Daniela. Ciao, by the way. But thanks a lot for the question. I want to say two things: that I would love to come to your class, and I would love actually to, which is something I'm trying to do, of course, where I'm based now. I would love, and this is almost an assumption in what I was describing, in this whole argument that I was trying to make, that the idea that designers need to understand a little bit more about democratic concepts, whatever they do, even if, because design is always involved, no? So whatever type of design they do, they should understand a bit more about those democratic principles and democratic theory, basics about democratic theories. That would be a really important exercise to talk more about democracies. And maybe some of you already also in this group do it, but to talk about democracy and democratic theories with students, that would be great. How to do it with a diverse class of people that come from different democracies or countries that might not recognize themselves as democracies. This is also a super interesting question that democratic theory is also asking itself. I think there's been a lot of assumptions because a lot of the theory, of course, was coming from certain part of the world, like we've got in design, or this kind of decolonizing movement. You have it in democratic theories as well, where understanding of democracies are trying to be more open and are trying to acknowledge this diversity. I think it's also very much in line with this idea from Soward of going away from the normative. Representative democracy is, and looking into real democracy. It talks about looking into what is going on in what we call a democratic design. What is really going on? I think it's exactly this. It calls it second order, but it's basically this. From below, from the reality, from existing democracies or other modes of governments, that we can understand what is going on and acknowledge and be aware of the difference. What is also really interesting for me, and I'm nowhere near like articulating this, but is how people who come from different countries that have different democratic institutions or non-democratic institutions, how they understand design. In this argument that I'm trying to make, that there is a participatory design comes from the Scandinavian countries. And as Keith Murphy is telling us, is embodying the good Scandinavian design is really embodying a series of values and principles that come from the Swedish and the Swedish government and the Swedish understanding of democracy. So how different democratic countries or non-democratic countries understand design, what practices of design they develop or enable, that would be a really interesting reflection to make. And I would love to, come to your class and in general to bring these two classes in design and in these classes which have different backgrounds.
Thank you. We have maybe one clarification or question, or what do you call it, in the chat. We have a couple in chat, but the first one here from Aidan, I think it's and that is, you mentioned that you were interested in feedback. Are there any areas of the ideas you presented you are especially looking forward to the group's thoughts on?
Many. I know I'm aware I presented a lot of different parts. I was trying to check two things: if the arguments kind of flows if you could follow the arguments that I tried to make at the beginning, and I was trying to repeat a little bit at the end, but then I thought let's have more time for conversations. So if the argument makes sense, but also how in your work this different relationship of design and democracy resonate or don't. How do you see design being used in democracy? What examples can you relate to through this framing that I'm providing, where I understand design to be always involved, but not always intentionally involved? And so what happens when design is intentionally involved, when designers are engaging with the questions of the political principles? Does that happen at all in your work? And do you think this should be a role for designer, actually, that you can imagine? And I'm sure, yeah, I don't know who's in the audience exactly, but I guess there's going to be a mix even from government, maybe, or from other institutions or organizations that try to advance democracy. Those were like the kind of feedback, and of course in other areas would be great as well.
Perfect, thank you. Do you have any questions, reflections? In the meantime, you're trying to find the button for raise your hand. I can have some kind of question, and that is because just before, as I told you, Paola, just before lunch, we had some kind of study circle around one of your chapters in a coming book, and in this meeting we were a couple of designers working within public sector, and the discussion we had, and I think that might be interesting to have and hear your reflection on, is at least in Sweden, most of the designers within the public sector work in the public organizations and not in the more democratic forms, like working with politicians now. And I think that whose role is it to develop a new form of democracy or to expand the democracy? Is it from the political level, or is it from the more civil servants level? Because from my perspective, as more coming more from the political science, I think that it could also be dangerous if this work is done only within the civil servants, with the civil servants agenda, and how to find that mixture where we involve both the politicians and the civil servants and the citizens as well, to find some kind of form of extended democracy.
I think, thanks, Kalle. I think we were discussing a little bit some interesting thoughts and points I think that you had this morning. I was not there, but the first thing for me is this definition of what is democracy that I tried to say at the beginning is almost like, in order to have a really informed conversation and fruitful conversation around democratic design or democracy and design, we need to understand what is the democracy that we're talking about. And I'm not just referring to the democracy that happens in Parliament. So it's almost like, there is an assumption in your question that the democracy is what is done by the political parties and in the elected politicians in the political sphere. And I'm trying to say this is one way, absolutely, but there's other ways of understanding democracy. So this is maybe first of all part of my answer to the question. So democracy happens also outside of the Parliament and engages different people, including civil servants. And I think one thing that is interesting for me of this, it would be really interesting to see those politicians to be more engaged in conversation around political principles with the civil servants and with many others as well, civil society organizations, or the designers involved, of course, the professional designers involved, etc., etc. The political principles, and I hope that was clear, they're not political in the sense of like being for one party or another. They're not political in the sense of the politicians or the political in the parliaments, but they are political in the sense of taking a stance for what is that the democratic design is trying to achieve out of within the democratic minimum and on top of the democratic minimum. So they are political because they are asked questions of what is more important to different people in different contexts regarding, for instance, the role of civil society organizations, or the role of like decentralization, or the institute of the referendum versus the institute of the democratic design, like the assembly that I was mentioning before. Which of these democratic design is more relevant and why? So those political principles can and should, I would argue, be discussed by designers who work in the policy space together with civil servants and everybody they design with, and politicians might have to be involved, because those political principles and an alignment on those political principles would be almost like a precondition for that democratic design to happen. And then the solution and the designs can be very different, but it's so important to have this alignment on the political principles that I don't think, and I would be really interested to hear more about, I don't think it happens, and maybe has to do with this distinction that we have in mind with what is political, as in from within representative democracy, elected politicians, and what is not political, which is the role of the civil servants.
Thank you. And do you have any other questions, any reflections? Please raise your hand. I know we have a lot of people here that are willing to speak. Stefan, you had something in the chat?
Yeah, I'm reading in the chat.
Yeah, it was just a mind, what do you call it, mind tracking thing. Because a lot of those these enacted democratic spaces, or whatever I like to call it, I mean, they also occur in this chain of, let's call it chain of command, and just to have a boring word for it. We have politicians, like in Sweden, we have the political arena, and then we have the public sector arena, which is kind of one of the whole, an important idea is that there should be arm's length distance between those, right? So we don't get too much political steering of public sector organizations. And then when they do things, where they want an IT system, or they want to go whatever, they procure. But there is no inheritance of those important political principles towards those procured things, and they also become part of our those democratic spaces, which is kind of we're losing something there in just in kind of handover way, that is where we limit ourselves in thinking that we can't require a company to be contributing to democracy because it's too complicated. They will contribute to efficiency or to a low a low price for whatever, which is not necessarily a good thing. So it was just a super internal mind reflection.
But if I can just add, I liked a lot your idea, actually. I think from the chat that we could have those principles somehow embedded in the procurement. It could be part of a design brief. What are the principles that we're trying to advance from this design that I'm going to call democratic design when this conversation about the principles happens? So if this is there, then whatever the designer is asked to do becomes more within the realm of this democratic design. So we start asking those questions, and it would be great. I think it's possible as well.
And just having the discussion in itself, right? What would it mean to have those principles in? Is part of that. Yeah. Fantastic.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I see the clock is ticking until 2:45. So if we don't have any raised hands, I think we stop the reflection and the discussion here.